I never imagined that a simple after-school moment could turn into one of the scariest experiences of my life. My 10-year-old daughter, Ella, walked home from school that day expecting the usual: the comforting smell of snacks, the sound of the TV in the background, and me sitting at the kitchen table waiting for her with a smile. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Instead, she found something she had never imagined possible: a locked door. Her key wouldn't turn. She tried again. Nothing. No sound. No footsteps. No familiar voice calling out from inside. Can you imagine the confusion of a child in that moment? The small panic building quietly as she twisted the key one more time, hoping, wishing, praying it would work. That was Ella. She was a careful, imaginative child. She didn't panic immediately. She tried to reason with herself. Maybe the door was stuck. Maybe someone was in the shower. Maybe this was just one of those days. But as the minutes stretched into half an hour and then an hour, reality began to seep in. She was alone on the porch, clutching her backpack, her small hands gripping the cold metal of the railing, the autumn air creeping into her bones. Meanwhile, I was at work, unaware that the normal rhythm of our day had already cracked. Then the phone rang. It was Ella. My heart froze the instant I heard her voice. There was a tremor in it. A mix of confusion, fear, and disbelief that I hadn't heard in years. "Mom, I can't get in. No one is here." That single sentence sent me racing out of the office, my mind spinning. I don't think I even remembered to grab my coat. I just drove. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every second felt like it could change everything. The drive home was filled with fragmented memories of my own childhood, of tense encounters with my mother, Margaret, and the subtle but constant tension that had always existed in our family. Margaret had never been a fan of my decisions, especially when it came to Ella. She had her ways, her rules, her expectations, and God help anyone who tried to push against them. But I never thought she would cross this line. Locking her out. Leaving her alone. Waiting hours. It didn't make sense. As I turned onto our street, I saw Ella sitting on the porch exactly as I had imagined in my mind: small, still, her posture rigid with the weight of fear. She hadn't moved much, didn't call out anymore. It was like the hours had stretched into a silent endurance test, testing her patience, her courage, her trust. And yet, despite it all, she hadn't panicked completely. She was waiting. Hoping. Holding on to the hope that someone would come, someone she trusted, someone who loved her. I parked the car quickly, almost skidding to a stop, and ran toward her. "Ella, I'm here," I called out, voice trembling more from anger and confusion than relief. Her small arms wrapped around me instantly. Relief, terror, and love collided in that embrace. I could feel her tiny heartbeat against mine. I could feel every second of her fear, every moment she had sat there wondering if someone would come. And I wanted to scream, not at her, but at the injustice of it all. How could this happen in a house that was supposed to be safe? Then the door opened. Margaret stepped out. She looked at us with an expression so cold, so unreadable, that for a moment I couldn't process it. And then she said the words that would echo in my mind for months: "Take your daughter and leave." I didn't argue. I didn't try to reason. I didn't even protest. I simply said, "Understood." My hands gripped Ella's shoulder, guiding her back to the car, my mind racing. What had happened to cause this? Why would a grandmother, someone who was supposed to love and protect, act with such finality, such cold detachment? And what did this mean for the safety and trust of my child? As we drove away, I couldn't shake the image of Margaret standing in the doorway, silent, her house behind us, her expression pale but unreadable. It was the calm before a storm I hadn't yet anticipated. And I knew instinctively that this wasn't just about anger or control. Something deeper, something more consequential, was unfolding. 3 days later, a knock at the door shattered our temporary peace. It wasn't just any knock. It was Deputy Harris, the sheriff in our county, holding a single envelope. My mother went pale when she saw him. And I knew, in that instant, that the events of that day were only the beginning. That locked door, that porch, that moment of fear and confusion, it had been a prelude. The truth behind Margaret's actions, the reason she had locked her granddaughter out, and the contents of the letter in the sheriff's hands, none of it was clear yet. But I could feel the weight of it, a quiet pressure building, hinting at secrets, disputes, and revelations that would change everything about our family. And, just like that, a moment that started with fear and confusion had escalated into something far more serious, something that demanded answers, something that I wasn't prepared for. I glanced at Ella, her small face pale but resolute. Her trust in me had never wavered, but I could see the questions forming in her mind, the silent wonderings about why someone she loved could act with such cruelty. And I knew I would have to answer them. Not just about that day, but about the complexities of family, the hidden motives that sometimes drive people to act in ways we cannot comprehend. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever seen a child waiting for someone who should be there and realize that no one was coming? That was Ella, sitting on our front porch, clutching her backpack like it could shield her from the cold reality of being ignored. Her small shoulders trembled, not from the chill in the air, but from fear, confusion, and a growing sense of helplessness. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the yard, stretching the hours into what felt like an eternity. I think the thing that hit me first was the helplessness. I wasn't there. I couldn't see her face in that moment. I didn't know if she was crying, if she was shaking, if she was trying to rationalize why her own grandmother had left her outside. The thought of her sitting there, waiting for an explanation that would never come, made my chest tighten. Have you ever felt that? The sudden, sharp realization that someone you love is vulnerable and you are powerless to protect them? When she first tried the key, it was a normal mistake. Keys get stuck. Doors jam. But then she tried again. And again. The persistent click of the lock failing echoed in my mind when she called me. The sound of it, in her voice over the phone, was almost unbearable, small, hesitant, but with an undertone of panic. "Mom, I can't get in." Just those 5 words, so simple, so ordinary, yet weighted with an unthinkable betrayal. I could feel the panic rising in myself. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly it hurt, eyes scanning the road like I could will the distance to vanish. Every second felt doubled. Every red light was a test of patience. I thought of all the times Ella had looked at me with trust in her eyes, believing that the world would be kind, that her home would be safe. And then, in a single moment, that trust had been violated by someone who should have been on her side. Ella, sitting on that porch, didn't panic fully, though. She tried to reason, as children often do. Maybe Mom was busy. Maybe Grandma had stepped out. Maybe the door was broken. And she waited. She sat there, legs crossed, small hands resting on her knees, staring at the door. Time stretched. Minutes became hours. Shadows lengthened. And yet, through it all, she didn't call anyone else. She didn't run into the street. She waited. She hoped. Meanwhile, I was racing home, fragments of our history with Margaret flashing through my mind. Her controlling tendencies, the subtle manipulations, the way she always had to have her way, even in small matters. But this was different. This crossed a line. How could someone do this to their own granddaughter? Did she not see the fear in that child's eyes? Or worse, did she enjoy the control, the sense of power over us? When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Ella exactly as I had imagined. Small. Alone. Waiting. Her eyes lit up when she saw me, but the relief didn't erase the fear entirely. She didn't immediately run into my arms. She was cautious, scanning me, maybe hoping I could somehow fix the impossible. That we could undo the cruelty that had left her outside for hours. The door opened slowly. Margaret stepped out, tall and rigid, her face unreadable. That moment, frozen in time, felt heavier than anything I had experienced. She didn't smile. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She simply said, "Take your daughter and leave." The words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of finality, of cold authority, of a decision made without care or compassion. I didn't argue. I didn't demand answers. I didn't shout or plead. I simply said, understood. There was a clarity in that acceptance, a decision to protect my daughter above all else, even if it meant swallowing my own shock and anger. I guided Ella to the car, feeling her small hand clutch mine, and felt a surge of protective resolve. But even as we drove away, the questions kept racing. Why would she do this? What had prompted such cruelty? Was it control, resentment, or something deeper? And most importantly, what would come next? Because anyone who could lock a 10-year-old out of her own home was capable of more than I could imagine. As we drove through the quiet streets, I glanced at Ella. She was pale but steady. Her trust in me had never wavered, but I could see the questions forming in her mind, the fear and confusion that had taken root. I wanted to tell her it would be okay. I wanted to promise her the world was safe. But I couldn't. Not yet. All I could do was hold her hand and drive, letting the engine hum beneath us, the road stretching ahead, and the shadow of Margaret's house fading behind. 3 days later, the tension would escalate in ways I could never predict. There would be a knock at the door. A sheriff. One letter. And my mother's face would go pale, revealing more fear than I had ever seen from her. That moment, like the locked door itself, would be a turning point. The prelude to truths I had no idea were waiting for me. But what that letter contained, and how it would change our family forever, was still unknown. And no one, not even Margaret, could have anticipated what was about to unfold. Have you ever been so furious you couldn't think straight, yet so terrified you could barely move? That's how I felt driving home to Ella, my heart pounding like a drum, my hands gripping the steering wheel as if I could steer the injustice away. Every second felt magnified. Every red light was an eternity. I kept imagining my daughter on the porch, small and shivering, clutching her backpack, wondering why the person who should have protected her had abandoned her. I thought about Margaret. My mother. 60 years old, rigid, controlling, always needing to have the upper hand. She had always been exacting in her rules, in her expectations of me, in her judgment of my parenting. But locking her granddaughter out of the house? That crossed a line I didn't even know existed. And yet, as I approached our driveway, I realized that this confrontation wasn't going to be simple. There would be no easy answers, no apologies, no quick fixes. I parked the car in front of the house, my foot lingering on the brake, my mind racing through what I would say, what I could say, what I shouldn't say. I grabbed Ella's hand. Her small fingers gripped mine, trembling ever so slightly. "Mom, what is happening?" she whispered. Her voice was soft, but edged with fear. I held her closer, trying to absorb some of her anxiety, trying to shield her from the storm we were about to walk into. Then we stepped onto the porch. The air was heavy with tension. Margaret stood there, her arms crossed, her posture rigid, her eyes unreadable. She didn't hesitate. She didn't soften. She just looked at us and then delivered her line. "Take your daughter and leave." It was surreal. The words were simple. 3 seconds later, it felt like a lifetime. The cold detachment in her voice, the way she avoided eye contact, the finality of her tone, it was almost like she was performing a ritual, removing Ella and me from her control. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I didn't plead. I simply said, understood. Why didn't I argue? Because at that moment, the priority wasn't me. It wasn't about pride or confrontation or even justice. It was about protecting my daughter from further harm, from the emotional storm raging inside that woman, from the unpredictable consequences of her anger. Sometimes, the best protection comes not from confrontation, but from retreat, moving your child out of harm's way and into safety. As we walked to the car, I noticed something in Margaret's expression. It wasn't just anger. There was a flicker of fear, a hint of hesitation, almost imperceptible, but there. I didn't understand it yet, but it made me wonder, what was driving her behavior? Was it simply control? Resentment? Or something deeper, something she was trying to hide? I buckled Ella into the car, keeping my voice calm, steady, even though inside I was boiling. "It's okay, baby," I said. "We're going home." She leaned against me, small body tense, trying to process what had happened. Her wide eyes reflected the confusion of a child who couldn't understand why someone she loved could act so coldly. As we drove away, the tension didn't leave. Every turn of the wheel brought the house further behind, but not the questions. What had caused her mother to act this way? Had we done something to provoke it? Or had this been brewing for years, waiting for the perfect moment to explode? I realized that sometimes, the people you expect to protect you can also be the source of your deepest fear, and that realization cuts sharper than anything else. Ella spoke quietly after a few minutes. "Mom, why did Grandma do that?" Her words were tentative, seeking comfort, seeking understanding. I didn't have an answer. I couldn't explain human cruelty that even I couldn't fully understand. All I could do was hold her hand and whisper, "I don't know, baby. But we're safe now. And I'll make sure nothing like that ever happens again." The drive was long. My mind raced with every possibility: legal issues, family disputes, hidden grudges, past resentments that had been simmering under the surface. Margaret had never been this extreme before. Something had pushed her over the edge, and I needed to understand it, not just for me, but for Ella. Because even as we reached our safe haven, I knew the consequences of this confrontation weren't over. And then, 3 days later, the next escalation arrived. It was quiet at first, a knock on the door. A single, deliberate knock that carried authority. Sheriff Harris, tall and imposing, stood at the threshold with one envelope in his hand. Margaret's reaction was immediate. Her face went pale, her posture stiffened, her eyes started around like she was calculating escape. I watched as the power dynamic shifted, as fear replaced the cold control she had wielded just days earlier. I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. What was in that envelope? Was it legal? Was it financial? Was it a revelation that she had been trying to hide for years? The suspense was suffocating. Ella clung to my leg, looking up at me with trust and fear intertwined. I tried to offer reassurance, but my mind was spinning with possibilities. And just like that, the confrontation at the porch, the locked door, and the hours of fear became only the beginning. That envelope promised revelations that would shake our family to its core, secrets that would expose truths none of us were fully prepared for. Because the truth behind Margaret's actions, the real reason for the cold command, the locked door, and the fear in Ella's eyes, was waiting inside that letter. And what came next would test everything I thought I knew about my family, my mother, and the boundaries I would enforce to protect my daughter. Have you ever held your child close and realized that the battle you thought was over had only just begun? That was me, standing in the doorway of our home 3 days after the porch incident, watching Sheriff Harris hold a single envelope in his hand. The weight of it seemed disproportionate, as if that small piece of paper carried the power to undo everything. Margaret's face, once so rigid and commanding, had gone pale. Her jaw was tight, her fingers trembling slightly, and I could see the fear flickering behind her eyes, a woman who, for decades, had thrived on control now facing something she couldn't manipulate. The envelope was thick, official, and sealed with the kind of wax insignia that always signals formality, importance, and consequences. Sheriff Harris gave a polite but firm nod to Margaret, as if the gravity of the moment were not lost on him. Margaret reached for it slowly, almost hesitating, as though touching it might trigger some irreversible chain of events. Ella clutched my hand, sensing tension but too young to understand the specifics. I knelt down to her level. "Baby, we're safe. Everything's going to be okay," I whispered, even though I wasn't entirely sure yet myself. Margaret finally tore the envelope open. Her eyes scanned the contents. Her lips parted slightly. She swallowed hard, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of decades of secrecy and control had been lifted, or maybe crushed, by what she read. The color drained from her face even further, leaving her ghostly pale. For the first time in my life, I didn't recognize my mother. The aura of invincibility, the unyielding dominance, the pride that had always defined her, it was gone. "What is it?" I asked cautiously, keeping my voice calm, steady, protective. I didn't want to startle her, and I certainly didn't want Ella to feel the shock before she needed to. But Margaret couldn't speak immediately. She just held the letter, trembling slightly, staring at the floor. And in that moment, the truth hit me. Whatever was in that envelope was bigger than our confrontation at the porch, bigger than a single cold command. It had the power to change everything. The letter revealed legal action. Someone had filed a claim that affected Margaret directly, something she had been hiding for years. It was connected to property, finances, and responsibilities she had attempted to control silently, manipulating the narrative around our family to keep her advantage. The document was clear. Failure to comply with certain conditions would have immediate consequences, and she had been caught off guard. This was why she had acted so aggressively toward me and Ella. The fear of exposure, the fear of losing control, had driven her to do something reckless, something cruel. As I read the edge of the envelope and understood the implications, I felt a mixture of vindication and unease. On one hand, justice had arrived in a form I hadn't expected. On the other, the lengths to which Margaret had been willing to go to maintain control over us, to intimidate and frighten, was staggering. I looked at Ella. Her small eyes were wide, curious, and perhaps sensing more than I realized. She didn't fully understand the legalities, but she knew something had changed. Her safety, her world, her home, the definitions of all of it had been shifted by that one letter. Margaret's voice trembled as she finally spoke, almost a whisper. I didn't expect this. Her words were not an apology. They were a confession, a recognition of vulnerability. For a woman who had spent a lifetime exerting dominance, control, and fear, this moment was crushing. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. It wasn't joy to see her shaken, it was relief that the threat she posed was mitigated, that my daughter would no longer be at the mercy of unpredictable cruelty. I took a deep breath and spoke firmly, calmly. Margaret, whatever happens, Ella is safe. And that safety is not negotiable. The weight of the authority in my voice, tempered by love and protection, was enough to make her flinch. For the first time, the power dynamics had shifted, permanently. The porch incident, the locked door, the hours of fear, they had all led to this moment, where justice, or at least consequence, finally caught up with her. Ella, sensing the change, squeezed my hand. I could feel her tiny fingers pressing into mine, her trust unwavering despite everything. That moment, her calm resilience, reminded me why I had acted as I did at the porch. She didn't need me to punish Margaret. She didn't need confrontation. She needed protection, safety, and reassurance. And that I had finally delivered. But the revelations didn't end there. The letter hinted at deeper issues, documents Margaret had hidden, responsibilities she had tried to sidestep, and legal obligations that now placed her in a position of vulnerability she had never experienced before. She had tried to assert control through intimidation, through fear, but the system, in its slow but inevitable way, had exposed the cracks. It was a lesson in consequences, accountability, and the limits of dominance. As Margaret stood, pale and trembling, I realized how fragile power can be when it's built on manipulation and fear. And I realized how strong love can be. Love that refuses to allow a child to sit alone on a porch, love that acts decisively in the face of danger, love that protects and preserves what matters most. Ella looked up at me, her eyes wide and unafraid now. She didn't need to understand all the legal complexities, the threats, or the hidden motives. She only needed to know one thing: her mother would always fight for her. And in that moment, that was enough. But even as we breathed, as relief slowly replaced fear, one question lingered in the air. What else had Margaret hidden over the years? What other truths had been kept from us, waiting for exposure? And more importantly, how would the next chapter of our family story unfold now that one door had been closed and another had been irrevocably opened? Because in families, in love, and in life, the letters we never expect, the revelations we never anticipate, and the confrontations we never plan, often carry the power to change everything. And what came next, as I realized, would test our resilience, our courage, and our bond as mother and daughter in ways we hadn't yet imagined. Have you ever felt the relief of finally protecting someone you love, only to realize that the journey isn't over? That was me, sitting in the quiet of our home after the storm had passed, after the locked door, after the porch, after the letter, reflecting on everything that had just happened. My daughter, Ella, sat beside me, her small fingers intertwined with mine, her head leaning against my shoulder. She was safe. She was calm. She was finally free from the fear that had haunted her for days. And yet, the echoes of what had transpired, the cruelty, the fear, the control, lingered. It started with the door. A simple key. A small child trying to enter her own home. That should have been ordinary. But Margaret's actions transformed it into a moment of fear, betrayal, and tension. And then came the confrontation, the drive, the finality of her words, "Take your daughter and leave." It was cold, precise, and yet it carried a hidden fear, a crack in her carefully maintained authority. I knew then that this wasn't just about power. It was about secrets, about a lifetime of control, and about a reckoning that had finally arrived. 3 days later, the letter from the sheriff confirmed everything I had suspected. Margaret had been hiding more than just resentment or control. She had been concealing responsibilities, obligations, and consequences she could no longer avoid. The look on her face when she read that letter was unforgettable. Pale, trembling, and stripped of all pretense, she was finally confronted with the truth. And in that moment, I understood something vital. Fear is a tool, but it can be exposed. Control is fragile, and truth has a way of surfacing when it's most necessary. I held Ella close, feeling her trust and courage, and realized that parenting is rarely about confrontation with the world itself. It's about holding someone's hand through fear, about providing safety when uncertainty looms, about being the anchor in the storm. My daughter didn't need me to argue with her grandmother. She didn't need me to demand explanations. She needed me to act, to protect her. And I did. But the lessons didn't stop there. I reflected on Margaret's behavior, how control, fear, and secrecy can warp relationships, even within families. It was a stark reminder that sometimes the people who should protect us are the ones capable of the deepest harm, whether intentional or driven by hidden motives. And yet, the confrontation had shown me the limits of that power. Even someone as controlling as Margaret could be held accountable. Even the most calculated intimidation could be disrupted. Even love, protection, and courage could prevail. Ella looked up at me, her eyes wide but calm, and I knew the moment would shape her understanding of trust, resilience, and safety for years to come. She learned that day that fear can be temporary, but love and protection are permanent. She learned that being brave doesn't always mean fighting. Sometimes it means waiting, trusting, and letting someone act decisively on your behalf. And she learned that she had a mother who would never let her face danger alone. The truth is, families are complicated. They carry histories, grudges, secrets, and patterns that can sometimes erupt in ways that feel inexplicable. But in the end, the moments that matter most are the ones where courage, care, and love intersect. Where you make the choice to act, to protect, and to ensure that the most vulnerable are safe. That choice defines not just parenting, but humanity. As I reflected, I also realized something sobering. What we experienced could have been far worse if we hadn't acted decisively. The locked door could have been the beginning of a long pattern of intimidation, a lesson in fear rather than protection. The confrontation could have escalated if I had reacted emotionally rather than strategically. And the letter, that single document, could have shifted power in ways we hadn't yet seen. Every step had required awareness, courage, and calm. And in that, I found a profound sense of empowerment. But even in the relief, one thought lingered. What other truths had been hidden over the years? What other secrets had Margaret carried that might surface later? And more importantly, how would we ensure that Ella never had to experience fear from someone who was supposed to protect her again? In families, the line between love and control can be blurred. The moments of fear, betrayal, or intimidation can feel insurmountable. But courage, clarity, and protection can redefine that line. I chose to act in love, not anger. I chose to prioritize safety over pride. I chose to ensure that my daughter would never feel abandoned in her own home. And that choice changed everything. Ella squeezed my hand gently. "Mom, thank you," she whispered. And in that simple phrase, I felt the full weight of what had occurred. The fear, the tension, the betrayal, all of it had led to this moment of trust, understanding, and bond. It was a victory, but also a reminder that vigilance and courage are ongoing responsibilities. Because the truth is, one locked door, one moment of fear, and one envelope from a sheriff can change everything in an instant. But love, protection, and action define the legacy we leave for our children. And as we walked forward together, I knew that our story was far from over, but we were ready for whatever came next. So I leave you with this. In moments of fear and uncertainty, when those who should protect fail, act decisively. Stand firm. Protect those who cannot protect themselves. And remember, one brave choice, made in love, can change everything.